Have you ever wanted to get inside the inner workings of high-profile criminal cases? True Crime and Human Design explores thrilling stories that reevaluate themes through an energetic lens. What new details and pockets of understanding might we see when we apply a human design filter to some of life's darkest corners? I'm your host, Corrine Araujo, and this is True Crime and Human Design. Hello. I want to specifically use this podcast to go through Jeffrey Dahmer and provide greater insight and less dramatized media for you all. This will not cover his human design. This is really meant to provide you guys with more details, more understandings of him, and more depth into his crimes before we go into his human design chart. All of the people that we will discuss and go into and explore, they have a history, they have past, and I think it's really important for those to be recognized to also cultivate an awareness around why I'm pulling out certain areas of their human design without having to explain it all and get super lost. So right off the bat, I want to give a better understanding and a timeline of Jeffrey Dahmer's history. Dahmer had his first kiss when he was 13 or 14 years old. At the time of his first kiss, he was also dissecting a pig in science class. It was at this point that he realized that kissing a boy gave him the same euphoria as dissecting a pig. This is when Jeffrey Dahmer began to bring dead animals home and dissect them. Instead of using this pertinent time to socialize with others, he spent his time cutting up animals. His childhood consisted of extreme tension between his parents, specifically his mom. There's been things thrown out there. I don't want to just diagnose her, but I wouldn't be surprised if she had postpartum in what we know as postpartum. And his dad was not sympathetic. Jeffrey did abuse alcohol because he was trying to cope with the world around him. And his parents divorced when he was 18. So you may be asking me, Corinne, okay, that's cool and all, but he had his first kiss when he was 13 or 14 years old and was dissecting a pig. Isn't that weird that he was as euphoric as he was kissing a boy when he was dissecting a pig? And my answer is no. Developmentally, adolescents are meant to really use this time exploring their sense of self, getting to know their passions, their interests, what they like, what they don't like. I tell people all the time, an adolescent's baseline is they're going to lie to you. They're going to lie because the lie is actually about self-exploration. They don't want to necessarily be stopped from exploring themselves. The whole process of teenagers is just so significant. It's such a crucial time developmentally. And what happens when our needs aren't met developmentally from prior times? So say Dahmer is 13, 14 years old. Developmentally, do I believe he was at 13 and 14 years old with his past? No, because there was a significant amount of disruption occurring in the home. There was what we call dysregulated caregiving. His mother wasn't attuned to his needs, and we can see this in the postpartum. His father placed a lot of blame on his mother for how Jeffrey was, and Jeffrey's brother reported that when Dahmer would get mad, he would go outside and start basically beating up a tree, slamming a stick into a tree. Now, as someone who specializes in the nervous system, in trauma, which means specializing in heightened crisis in these really intensive situations or heightened times of dysregulation, it's really not that weird that he went out and hit a tree. All that's telling me is that externally, he's needing to release his fight or flight, got gearing up, the adrenaline. It was like someone was pushing on the pedal and his heart started racing. And there's that sympathetic nervous system. And so he went outside and started hitting a tree. Now, I'm sure if it was mentioned, if his brother quickly mentioned it, then he probably felt like it was called out. And what I mean by this is think about things you've done or things maybe you do to release anger, to release stress, and people have a response to you and they're like, why are you doing that? Now, imagine Jeffrey Dahmer. He's a youth, he's a kid, he doesn't have a sense of self. We'll go into his human design too of his significant insecurity, which is honestly very prominent when looking at his case right off the bat. He is riddled with insecurity and this need for more secure attachment because he had insecure attachment. He had dysregulated caregiving. His parents didn't model what rupture and repair is. And rupture and repair is ultimately you get into a fight, you get into an argument, a conflict happens, and then conflict resolution happens. When that doesn't happen, a child learns those behaviors. A child starts learning those behaviors actually in the womb. So, how their caregivers are responding to external events start actually creating these habitual response patterns while a child is in the womb, let alone when he comes out and those behaviors persist and there's none of that conflict resolution done. There's none of that repair work. So he learns how to navigate relationships in this unhealthy dynamic as is. And he felt as though he was almost second best or just tossed to the side and his brother was the favorite. Already there, we have a lot of insecurities, a lot of dysregulation. His mom's not attuned to his needs. We have all these developmental stages and all these different developmental theories. And if I do need to ever dive into it, let me know and we can explore that separately. But I'm not going to dive into all of those right now. Ultimately, you have a newborn. They have their developmental stage. These happen, these are created, and these are significant because it's saying the needs that need to be met in order for the child to progress, in order for the child to continue to grow, in order for the child to be developmentally appropriate. When there's this misattunement and needs aren't being met because your caregivers aren't attuned to your needs, just because you hit 7, 8 years old doesn't mean you jump onto a different developmental stage. Your needs still weren't met from there. So you're not seeking to progress in ways that someone whose needs were met. So instead of him seeking friends, he still wanted love and care and nurture and maybe a little bit more nurture from his parents. He needed to really feel safe, really feel secure. He needed them to create that foundation. He needed them to model that conflict resolution and really implement that in the home in order for him to feel secure and be able to develop pro-social relationships. But just because he's growing doesn't mean he's going to do the thing, which this is something that needs to be understood. When he kissed a boy, he was also dissecting a pig. He was exploring his sexual identity. This is major for adolescence. You explore who you love, what you like. That includes your sexual identity, your sexuality. That includes that spectrum as well. And because he was gay, especially during this time period, he was born in the 1960s. During this time period, it was not accepted. We are approaching the 80s or in the 80s when he's committing these crimes. Just generally speaking, what happened during the 80s? AIDS. So gay marriage was not accepted. He had a kiss with a boy who typically, if it was a girl, there would be less confusion and less significance around this because he can't talk to his dad or feels as though he can't talk to his dad. Society and systemically, he already knows that being gay is going to send you to hell and it's not allowed in all of the things. So he can't get support differentiating, hey, Dad, I like this girl, and I also really liked dissecting an animal. I'm confused. There's not that open communication. There's not that dialogue because, like I said before, there was this misattunement to his needs. So there wasn't that open dialogue as is, let alone an open dialogue about him kissing a boy. This is really a time where he needed to go socialize with others, and it's heavy on socialization. Friends are first, friends are the world most of the time for teenagers, and that's developmentally appropriate. He didn't do that. Instead, he continued to isolate himself, tuck himself back, tuck himself away because he felt different. His needs weren't being met. And he continued to explore dissecting animals. There's a history of science in his family, which his father really introduced and taught him and took the steps with him to explore this passion. Yes, it was taken too far because all of these factors that we're exploring, but it's not weird to be passionate about science. Dahmer recalls his childhood being full of extreme tension between his parents. He claims that because of this tension, he felt extremely alone and believed he was pushed to the side for his brother. He spent his time segregated from others. His feelings of loneliness didn't only exist at home, but they existed in school as well. Dahmer would sprint down the hallway in a manner that brought attention to him, in which other classmates called doing the Dahmer. He recalls creating a fantasy world in which gave him power and control that he felt that he lacked in the real world. So here he was already escaping from the real world, escaping from his circumstances, escaping from a world that made him feel like he had no control, he had no voice, he had no autonomy, and there was nothing he could do about it. He was already going in to these fantasy worlds, which further sets him up for not being attuned to the present, not living in the reality, not being aware, not being self-aware, not understanding the full gravity and the significance of choices or actions that someone who is present, who is attuned, who is self-aware would have. At the age of 16, Dahmer began drinking heavily. As we know, his murders consisted of poisoning drinks and giving them to men that he brought back home. The final victim that ended up getting away from Dahmer was who informed the police. He stated that Dahmer continuously drank throughout the process, getting more and more belligerent, which assisted the young man in getting away. During his time in the military, fellow bunkmates commented on Dahmer's drinking, and one mentioned how Dahmer would get to a point where he would chase another man down a hallway. This man recalls the look in Dahmer's eyes. Dahmer would go back to his bed and pretend to be asleep. When the bunkmate was close, he would jump back up to attack him. Dahmer was a medic in the Army and ultimately ended up getting kicked out for good because of drinking. At this point, Dahmer was kicked out of school and the Army, resulting in him going back to live with his father. When Dahmer was 18 years old, his parents divorced. His mother took his brother, and his father went off by himself or with his girlfriend, leaving Dahmer alone in his home. So he was only a senior in high school. This is a child who is seeking attachment, seeking love, seeking secure attachment, seeking relationships, especially from his caregivers. Attachment is extremely prominent for all of us, and he really is someone that exhibits a need for secure attachment to another level. By his parents leaving, ultimately, they did abandon him. Everything that he is fearful of, everything that's creating these insecurities really did exist in almost the worst thing that could happen did happen. He was abandoned. He does state that he believes that this is when things began to spiral, which is actually a ton of self-awareness. Because as a professional that's looked into his case and understands and looks through attachment theory and neuroscience and trauma theory, he never wanted anyone to leave him. Because of the abandonment, Jeffrey began to have strong desires about not wanting people to leave him and hated sleeping alone. 3 weeks after his high school prom, Dahmer found his first victim. He was a male hitchhiker who Dahmer thought was attractive and brought him back to his house where he got Stephen Hicks drunk. When Stephen attempted to leave, we saw a trauma response, the visceral response. He did not want him to leave because of his attachment and lack of attunement. This is when his maladaptive coping strategies and this very primal survival state kicks in. When we're in survival mode, we no longer seek connection. We're seeking protection, and we're seeking to get our needs met. We don't care about what we do to the other person. Stephen attempted to leave, and Dahmer killed him and dismembered his body. It wouldn't be until 9 years after his first murder that he would kill his second victim. In between the first murder and his second victim is when Dahmer's drinking became progressively worse, leading him to flunk out of school, get kicked out of the army, and end up living with his grandmother. His grandmother was the one person that he actually cared about. This is what I emphasize whenever I go to attachment theory and the significance of attachment. I tell people to go to Jeffrey Dahmer's case. He did not kill for 9 years. Why? Reported and theorized, and what I've gathered, it was because of his grandmother that he tried to suppress his urges and control his drinking. However, after waking up to find a dead man next to him, he accepted this as his fate from God. Now that we've gone over his history and gotten a summary of that, I want to start diving into what was going on during the time of his crimes. To start, Dahmer would typically kill on a Friday. He would take a sedative drug and grind it prior to bringing his next victim home. He would drink by himself and observe others within the gay bar. He would offer the victim a drink at his place and also offer to pay them $50 because he's a photographer if they just do a quick modeling shoot. When they got back to his place, he would put the crushed up drug in a drink, and after drugging the men, he would act out sexual fantasies. And when it came time to kill, he would drink even more. What this is saying is that he doesn't want to be completely coherent while he was actually committing the act. He had to continue to detach himself, dissociate, and really separate himself from reality through getting completely inebriated. He preserved skulls, body parts, and consumed one man's biceps in order to keep the person with him longer. He quite literally wanted to be together forever with his victims. Dahmer loved his grandma, as I've mentioned. So when he went to live with her, he did try his hardest to stop the urges. He would attend church, read the Bible, and stop drinking for 2 years. Dahmer tried to suppress his homosexual thoughts and just sexual thoughts in nature. During this time, he stole a mannequin in which he tried to pretend it was a real person. He also tried to dig up a dead body of an 18-year-old boy. So the event that led to his arrest ultimately was in July of 1991. Tracy Edwards actually ended up escaping and was found wandering the streets with handcuffs, claiming that he had been drugged and restrained. This led police to Dahmer's location. Eventually, he just gave up trying to cover the bodies, so he continued to leave the bodies out, and the odor was significant in his apartment. Just a couple of the areas in which we can see systemic racism, systemic oppression, and systems of power really enabling Dahmer are, for one, he was pulled over after Stephen Hicks, his first victim. He was going to dispose of his body, and his body was actually in garbage bags in the back seat of his car. He was pulled over in the middle of the night from a police officer, and Dahmer was able to give him some sort of reason, some sort of excuse to get out of it. And ultimately, if the officer just took a moment to look in his back seat, the other murders could have been prevented. This is a really crucial moment for Dahmer because this is almost like an end-all be-all. I can imagine that his heart was racing. He was thinking, this is it. It's over. I'm getting caught. In that moment, he did not get caught. Quite the opposite. He was let go. So he learned, and it was almost like a rewarding of he's able to push his boundaries and get away with this. He did really use his status. What I mean by status is his identity, the different intersects of his identity to his advantage. And this is where we see that systemic racism majorly plays a role, because at that point he was 18, and up until he was caught, he was still a younger white male. And there are multiple accounts of people letting him go, a judge making a statement about him seeming or being a really nice boy with a promising future, as the trial was for sexual assault of a minor. So his privilege really was so prominent here. That's why this needs to be emphasized. These are factors that we cannot exclude. In Dahmer's apartment building, Glenda Cleveland resided. Glenda Cleveland plays a significant role in this whole case because she was, I believe, a middle-aged woman of color who continuously contacted the police. She continuously spoke about Dahmer, about concerns about Dahmer, about the odor coming from his apartment. She also had been part of the incident where her daughter and her niece alerted authorities about a 14-year-old boy. This 14-year-old boy was drugged and had hydrochloric acid injected into his brain. Dahmer left the victim alone to run to the store to grab beer. Upon returning home, the 14-year-old boy was outside, naked and disoriented, with neighbors trying to assist him. Police were called, and Dahmer convinced authorities that he and the victim had been lovers, despite Glenda Cleveland continuously notifying and alerting that something was wrong. Back in his apartment, the victim was injected with more hydrochloric acid, which deemed fatal. His body was dismembered and his head was retained. After that, the two officers were recorded, and the recordings have been released and are known to the public. They had told dispatchers that they both needed to go shower after interacting with this gay couple. There in itself is also a systemic failure, a systemic oppression. This is where the intersects of your identity really play a role. If they had walked into his apartment they probably would have noticed the odor even more so, to the extent that they could not ignore it. And there was a body laying in Dahmer's bedroom. However, they were too concerned about catching the gay. Glenda Cleveland continuously reported Dahmer. And when she saw the 14-year-old victim's photo in the newspaper regarding his disappearance, she called police again, but no one returned her phone call. She even tried to alert the FBI, but her calls went nowhere. By the time Dahmer was caught 2 months later, he had already killed the 14-year-old boy and 4 other men. So she had called continuously throughout this process, telling and reporting that something was wrong, that she would hear screaming, that she would hear fighting, and there was an awful smell, and they ignored her. The reality was she was a woman of color in between the 1970s and early 1990s in a poverty-stricken neighborhood. The racism very much existed, and they really chalk this up to her being hysterical. Just in 2 months from the contact with police with the 14-year-old boy until Dahmer was caught on July 22nd, 5 murders had been done. This could have been stopped if there wasn't discrimination perpetuating through the system, through law enforcement, through authorities in power. Glenda Cleveland had also called after the police officers did show up with the 14-year-old victim to check in and see what the status was. And the 2 police officers chalked it up to 2 boyfriends, and they can't arrest him for being gay. Her point, which she does say, again, an audio was released, in her saying, ultimately, I'm not asking you to arrest him because he's gay. It's because that was a young boy and something was wrong. She was more than right. He literally had a hole in his head from being drilled into. Reverend Jesse Jackson actually ended up coming to Milwaukee in August of 1991 to address the Black community and encourage people in positions of power to take accountability for their actions, because the police officers were originally suspended for a very short period of time, and they returned disgusting. He sought out his victims. They were gay men. What he found was if he resided in a poverty-stricken neighborhood, he would receive less attention because he was the white male living there. So he wasn't seen as more or less the problem, the criminal, a person really stirring up issues. He was able to fly more under the radar, and he went to gay bars. So at this time period, I've said it and I don't need to keep repeating it, but homophobia and discrimination perpetuated throughout. He was able, especially this is during the AIDS crisis and epidemic, so it was normal for gay men to be there 1 minute and not be there the next. Dahmer was really able to use these factors to his advantage and get away with these murders for as long as he did. This wraps up his summary. Now head on over to my next podcast to really go through Jeffrey Dahmer's human design and get to know the energetics of him a little bit deeper.